Hi, this video is going to help you remember the key events in the middle of the Cold War from 1949 to 1970. All you got to do is remember three words: mad, crazy and anxious. That's exactly how people were feeling in this period, because any small event seemed like it could lead to a nuclear war destroying the entire planet. So let's get started. Each letter of mad, crazy, anxious is going to help you remember the big events in the correct chronological order. M, mutually assured destruction. A, Asia. D, Destalinisation. C, change in Hungary. R, rockets. A, asked to leave Berlin. Z, zone. Y, Yuri Gagarin, first man in space. A, arguing over the U-2. N, not leaving Berlin. X, crossing Berlin. I, I'm a Berliner. O, only seconds from nuclear war. U, unwinnable war. And S, Prague Spring and man in space. So the first one of these is M, mutually assured destruction. 1949 was a great year for communism because the USSR developed its first atomic bomb. Mutually assured destruction makes war between the two superpowers completely illogical. Leaders of both sides know if they attack the other side with nuclear weapons, they are going to be attacked back with nuclear weapons, which is why the whole world from 1949 to 1970 is mad, crazy and anxious. Our next letter is A, Asia goes communist. 1949, also a great year for communism because Chairman Mao wins the Chinese Civil War, making China a communist country. This is massively important as China is going to play a big role in the Cold War and still in the world today. The other reason we need to remember A, Asia in 1949 is the Korean War. Communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea go to war with each other. North Korea is backed up by the Chinese and the Soviets behind them, and the South Koreans are backed up by the US and their Western allies. The war lasts 3 years and ends with the peninsula divided in two, and Communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea are still divided today. Our next letter and the final letter of MAD is D, Destalinisation. Joseph Stalin died in 1953 and a new Soviet leader takes over called Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev gives a secret speech promising to be a less repressive ruler than Stalin and criticising some of the things that Stalin had done. This is a huge shock to people in the communist world because the Communist Party had stopped any criticism of Stalin ever being printed, and up till now the Communist Party had arrested and murdered anybody that criticised Stalin. Khrushchev's new policy was called Destalinisation, keeping the country communist but removing the worst aspects of Stalin's rule. People were so shocked when he gave his speech in Moscow, several people actually fainted. So our last letter of MAD is D, Destalinisation, and that brings us on nicely to our first letter of crazy, C, change in Hungary. After Khrushchev promised to de-Stalinize, people in Hungary began protesting, pulling down statues of Stalin, cutting out the communist symbol from the Hungarian flag and demanding a new leader, Imre Nagy. Nagy decides, well, let's see if the Soviets are going to be true to their word. And he brings in reforms, he tries to make the country richer, more democratic and less repressive. But the final thing he does is try to leave the Warsaw Pact. And Khrushchev cannot accept that. So although he's promised to be less repressive than Stalin, Khrushchev sends in the tanks and Warsaw Pact troops to crush the Hungarian Uprising. And the Hungarian Uprising proves that this Warsaw Pact works because troops from the other Warsaw Pact countries also get involved to crush the Hungarian Uprising. As a result, many Hungarians flee to the west and the USSR looks repressive. But the new president of the United States, Eisenhower, does not get involved because he's too busy with elections back in the USA, and also because Britain and France were making the West look bad by trying to invade the Suez Canal, but I'll leave that for another video. Our next letter is R, rockets. The Soviet Union is the first to develop ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, huge rockets which they used to put a satellite in space. The first ever satellite up in space was called Sputnik. It went up, circled the Earth a few times and eventually crashed back down to Earth. But this really scares the United States because they are falling behind in the space race and falling behind in the arms race. Those same rockets could be used to fire nuclear warheads between continents, so intercontinental. Now neither side needs to fly over in bombers and physically bomb the other side. They can shoot rockets, missiles from one continent to the other and deliver much larger warheads because they've also developed hydrogen bombs. So this is increasing tension in our arms race. This means that for the rest of the period of the Cold War, scientists say the doomsday clock is at 5 minutes to midnight. We are very, very close to an all-out nuclear war which could potentially destroy the whole planet. Our next letter is A, ask to leave Berlin. Who does? Khrushchev asks the West to leave Berlin. He actually doesn't ask, he demands. It's an ultimatum. He says to the West, you've got 6 months to move your militaries out of West Berlin. Why? Well, West Berlin is still occupied by French, British and particularly American troops following the end of World War II. But the whole of Berlin is in the eastern communist zone of Germany. And Khrushchev doesn't want America having a little outpost in the middle of communist East Germany, because by this point, wages are much higher in West Berlin and West Germany. And any East German who wants to leave communism and earn higher wages can't simply walk across the border to West Germany. But if they come to West Berlin, they can simply walk from one side of the street to the other, because the dividing line between the two militaries was often in the middle of one street. And so people could just leave communism by going to Berlin and walking to the other side. Khrushchev could not accept this. It's called the brain drain. The most intelligent people seem to be leaving, and so he demands that the West leave West Berlin. In response, Eisenhower agrees to talk to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev actually drops his demand during the talks, but we'll come back to this with one of our later letters. Our next letter is Z, Zone. In 1959, Fidel Castro leads Cuban revolutionaries to overthrow an American-backed dictator. This creates a socialist country right next to America and really scares the American people and the American government, because for the first time there's a communist country right within their zone, in their sphere of influence, just a few miles off of the coast of Florida. Our next letter, and our final letter of crazy, is Y, Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin is the first man to go up into space and come back down to Earth. Yuri Gagarin was a Russian cosmonaut, and he's sent up in 1960. Again, this proves that the USSR is ahead in the space race and seems to be ahead in the science race. So it really scares America, puts pressure on the American government to invest more in science, especially in space, because they're worried space could be used to wage war. Our next letter, and our first letter of anxious, is A. They argue over a U-2 spy plane. In 1960, Eisenhower and Khrushchev were supposed to be meeting again to discuss Khrushchev asking Eisenhower to leave Berlin. However, before the summit, the Americans sent a U-2 spy plane flying over the USSR to spy on the communists. They didn't think this spy plane could get shot down because the U-2s were very, very light and very, very quick and flew very, very high. Unfortunately for them, the spy plane was shot down, but they thought the pilot would commit suicide, so they were convinced that the Russians would never capture the pilot. Eisenhower completely denied that America had been spying on the Soviet Union until Khrushchev sprang his trap. The pilot had parachuted down, had not committed suicide, and had been captured by the USSR, and they brought him out in front of the television cameras, proving that Eisenhower was lying about the spying. At the Paris summit, Khrushchev arrived. When America refused to apologise, he stormed out and brought back his ultimatum asking Eisenhower and the West to leave Berlin. So, A, 1960, they argue over the U-2 plane being shot down at the Paris summit. Our next letter of anxious is N, not leaving Berlin. Who's not leaving? JFK, the new American president, meets up with Khrushchev at the Vienna summit in 1961. Khrushchev continues to ask that the West leave Berlin, and Kennedy says, I'm not backing down, I'm not going to leave Berlin. And this brings us on to our next letter, X. You can remember X as a cross. They cross Berlin with a wall. Khrushchev's got no other option. He's demanded the West leave. Kennedy's refused to leave. Khrushchev could use the military to force them out, but that would risk World War III, and we've got to remember mutually assured destruction. We both know we're not really going to go to war. So the next best thing to stop that brain drain, he decides to build a wall straight through the middle of Berlin, between East and West Berlin. This works perfectly. It stops the brain drain. Anyone trying to leave, anyone trying to cross that wall is shot down. The wall has guard posts built all along it, and anybody that tries to leave is shot. Over the next few years, very, very few people managed to escape communism. Khrushchev has succeeded in ending the brain drain, but he's also failed because he makes communism look very, very bad. That brings us on to our next letter, which is I. I'm a Berliner. This is JFK's really famous speech in 1963. He flies in to West Berlin and gives a very famous speech where he even speaks in German and says, Ich bin ein Berliner, showing that he's supporting the West Germans against the aggression of the communists in Berlin. His speech makes him hugely famous and much more popular, although sadly he died the next year, but that's another story for another time. Our next letter of anxious is O, only seconds from nuclear war. The closest we get in the whole of the Cold War to either side pressing the button is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You'll remember from our previous letter Z that Castro has created a communist country within the American zone. America tried to overthrow Castro, and in response he asked for help from the USSR, who in 1962 begins sending nuclear weapons to the island. When America finds out about this, they are petrified. They realise there are now nuclear missiles which could be fired from Cuba, destroying a number of American cities. In response, Kennedy knows he can't go to war to force them out, so instead he decides to put a naval blockade around Cuba, stopping the Soviet Union delivering any more nuclear weapons to the island. Khrushchev declares this an act of war, and JFK goes on television to tell the American people that they are very, very close to nuclear war. Behind the scenes, his brother, Robert Kennedy, comes up with an idea to remove American missiles from Turkey, where America has missiles within range of Moscow, in return for the Soviet Union removing their missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev agrees on condition that America leaves Castro, and so Castro survives, but the doomsday clock is very, very close to midnight. We are only seconds from nuclear war in October 1962, the closest we get to nuclear war. This brings us on to our next letter, U, an unwinnable war in Vietnam. Before World War II, France was ruling Vietnam, but after World War II, a Vietnamese leader called Ho Chi Minh rises up against the French and kicks the French out of Vietnam. This leaves the country split between Ho Chi Minh's communists in the north and an American-backed capitalist dictator in the south. As a result, there's a war going on in Vietnam, similar in many ways to what had happened in Korea. America did not want to get involved, but successive presidents sent troops in secret to help the South Vietnamese fight the communists in the north. That all changed in 1964 when the new US president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was told that an American ship had been fired on by North Korean communists. This actually turned out not to be true, but it was the perfect excuse for Lyndon Johnson to begin increasing the number of troops in Vietnam. America sent more and more soldiers over to Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese, but the North Vietnamese kept sending guerrilla troops to sneak into Vietnam through neighbouring Laos, ambush American troops, and then disappear back into the jungle. Their guerrilla tactics really ground America down. And because so many Americans are dying in Vietnam, there's huge protests back home in America. New President Richard Nixon is elected in 1969, promising to finish the war. America bombed the hell out of the neighbouring countries around Vietnam, but even this didn't stop the North Koreans getting through. North Korea refused to give up and continued to send guerrilla fighters into the south despite suffering huge losses because it was their own country. America's big mistake in Vietnam was to think they were fighting communists when really they were fighting nationalists who did not want a foreign power interfering in their country. Eventually in 1975, Nixon agrees to leave on condition that the North Vietnamese will not invade the south, which the communists promised to do, but then straight away break their promise, and in 1975 Saigon falls and the whole of Vietnam becomes a communist country. It looks to some as though domino theory is in place and America is losing the Cold War. So Vietnam is hugely significant because it uses up a lot of America's money and causes huge protests back in America, and ultimately they could not win the war in Vietnam. Our final letter of anxious is S. There are two S's: Spring, the Prague Spring in 1968, and in 1969, the space race, America puts a man on the moon. And first of all, Czechoslovakia, another really important Warsaw Pact country, one of the richest countries in the Warsaw Pact. A new leader called Dubček arrives, promising to make the country richer, more democratic, and less repressive. Unlike in Hungary, Dubček is not saying he wants to leave communism. Dubček wants communism with a human face. He wants to keep them in the Warsaw Pact, but he wants more freedom and he wants the economy to work better. By this point, the Soviet Union's got a new leader, Leonid Brezhnev, and he goes along with Dubček's reforms until Dubček says he's going to allow trade and travel to the West. Brezhnev cannot accept trade and travel to the West because it would be an excuse for people to leave communism, just like the brain drain which Khrushchev ended by building the wall. So in 1968, the Prague Spring ends with Warsaw Pact troops and the Soviet army rolling into Prague. Unlike Hungary, there's not huge street fighting. There are some protests. For the most part, the USSR wins back control peacefully, and Brezhnev comes up with his new idea, his doctrine, which says any country trying to leave the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet sphere of influence will face invasion. This deters any other country from trying to leave the Warsaw Pact. In Prague, a student called Jan Palach burns himself to death in protest, but again, just like Hungary, the West doesn't do anything to get involved or help. Partly because America is too busy fighting its war in Vietnam, and partly because Western Europe is too busy with protests that are going on in Paris. The other hugely important thing to end our main events of the middle period of the Cold War is that in 1969, America puts a man on the moon. For a lot of this period, the USSR has been ahead in the space race, but when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, it was a huge propaganda victory for America.
The Eagle has landed. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So our big Cold War crisis we can remember with mad, crazy, anxious. 3 simple words, and that will help you remember the events in the correct order. Now, there are more events in this period of the Cold War. I've particularly picked these ones because if you're studying GCSE history in the UK, these are the ones that you're going to need. There are a lot of other events that are really interesting in this same time period going on in Africa and in other parts of Asia and Latin America, and I'll maybe make another video later to help you remember those. But I hope this video has helped. Mad, crazy, anxious.